السيدات والسادة ضيوف الكرام، نرحب بكم في مهرجان أبو ظبي بتنظيم من مجموعة أبو ظبي للثقافة والفنون. كإعلام إماراتي شاب أتفهم القيمة الكبرى للحوار الثقافي. الفنون والثقافات تلعب دورا محوريا في بناء جسور التواصل بين الشعوب والأمم. تعد دولة الإمارات العربية المتحدة بلاد الخير قيم الاحترام والتسامح والتنوير، ودورنا نحن الشباب الإماراتي أن نضم أيدينا معا لنشر هذه القيم. احتفالا بحضور أوركسترا الاتحاد الأوروبي للشباب لأول مرة في العالم العربي، وإسهاما في ترسيخ مكانة العاصمة أبو ظبي كمنارة ثقافية عالمية، بالتزامن مع إطلاق برنامج الإبداع من الاتحاد الأوروبي أوروبا المبدعة. تتناول ندوتنا اليوم الثقافة والدبلوماسية. يسعدني أن أقدم لحضراتكم كلمة مسجلة من المفوضة الأوروبية لشؤون التربية، الثقافة، الشباب وتعدد الثقافات، سعادة أندريا فاسيليو.
wish the Abu Dhabi Festival every success in this very special year. I can only applaud the festival's commitment to the role of culture in a complex, globalizing world. You make a vital contribution to a very important debate, a debate about our ability as different peoples with different cultures to live together in a spirit of peace and understanding. As a European Commissioner for Culture, I see this year's festival as a special moment for two reasons in particular. First, the European Union is launching its new program for the cultural and creative industries, Creative Europe. And second, the European Union Youth Orchestra is performing for the first time in the Arab world. Creative Europe wants to help artists, designers, and cultural leaders to find their place on the world stage and to embrace the opportunities of digitalization. Culture and the arts are the fuel of the digital world, and the appetite for creative content is booming. Creative Europe offers a budget of almost 1.5 billion euros, an increase of 9% compared to our previous program. We plan to support 240,000 European artists, 2,000 cinemas, 800 films, and 4,500 book translations. I would encourage everyone at this year's festival to take a look at what we are doing and to think about ways we could work together. And let me now say a few words about the European Union Youth Orchestra. Truly, I can think of no better symbol of the great power of art to bring people together. The orchestra represents a community of young talent speaking many languages, which works together to celebrate our common musical heritage. I'm very proud of the orchestra and wish it every success on its travels this year. And 2014 is no ordinary year. The European Union Youth Orchestra is performing in the Arab world for the very first time, a truly exciting event for everyone concerned. In the spectacular Emirates Palace Auditorium, here in Abu Dhabi, 118 of Europe's finest young musicians from the 28 countries of the European Union will join the orchestra's musical director, Vladimir Ashkenazi, in a thrilling program of popular classics. This performance will demonstrate the wonderful power of music to inspire and delight, and it marks another important milestone in the life of the Abu Dhabi Festival. I wish you all a very enjoyable time, and thank you for your attention.
الحضور الكريم، المتحدثون في ندوتنا الحوارية هذه هم السفير وليم البروفيسور الزائر للدبلوماسية العامة مدرسة فليتش للقانون والدبلوماسية جامعة تافتس الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية. سعادة بالوما أوشيا أرتيñano مؤسس ورئيس مؤسسة ألبينيز إسبانيا، مؤسس ورئيس كلية الملكة صوفيا للموسيقى. سعادة الدكتور زكي أنور نسيبة المستشار في وزارة شؤون الرئاسة. السيد مارشال ماركوس الرئيس التنفيذي لأوركسترا الاتحاد الأوروبي للشباب. وسعادة مايكل كوربين السفير الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية لدى الدولة مديرا للجلسة. شكرا لكم، نرجو لكم الفائدة والاستمتاع بالندوة الحوارية في مهرجان أبو ظبي 2014.
Thank you very, very much. And for me, it's a great, great honor to be here for my third Abu Dhabi Music and Arts Festival. And in fact, at my first or second Abu Dhabi Music Arts Festival, I participated in a panel with a subject on cultural diplomacy, and I had a chance to give my views on this extremely important subject as the American ambassador here, and as somebody who believes in culture and the value of culture. Today I've been promoted to moderator, so I get to give the opportunity to some real experts to speak on this subject. I will note the panel that I belonged in, the moderator was Rahimi, who's moved on to many, many more important duties these days and was in Kuwait today. For me, as ambassador, I'm particularly proud that this year we are the country of honor at the Abu Dhabi Music and Arts Festival. And as the United States of America, it's a great honor to be able to export and to share and exchange some of our cultural traditions, our cultural values, and our cultural creativity. And just in this Abu Dhabi Music and Arts Festival, first the exhibition of Bill Fontana, a truly incredible work which I recommend all of you see in the lobby of the Emirates Palace upstairs, which takes sound as a creative medium and builds art around sound. And it's a fantastic exhibition. And then, of course, the artistry of Renee Fleming on one hand and Herbie Hancock on the other just speaks to a communication that transcends politics, that transcends language, and that's the value of culture. So tonight, what I'm going to do, and I really, really want to thank the Abu Dhabi Music and Arts Festival and the founder, Artíñano, for this wonderful opportunity to do this. Our program this evening starts off with Mrs. Paloma who is, has been introduced already, but just what an honor is to have her here in this global crossroads and at this opportunity to discuss culture. And her reputation and her support for music and artistry around the world is so well known. But we will start off the program with a brief presentation and a video, a 10-minute video that she will present, and we're really honored to have that. And then we will turn to our panelists. Ambassador William Rugh. It gives me great honor to have one of my heroes from my early service in the Arab world, who was ambassador both in Yemen and in the United Arab Emirates from 1992 to 1995, and his wife, Andrea Rugh, is in the audience also. And it just shows the depth and length of our cultural cooperation here, that what Ambassador Rugh was famous for us young diplomats at that time was that he was one of our first public diplomacy ambassadors who came through the ranks speaking, breathing, and knowing about the value of culture. And so it's a great honor to have him on the panel. Zaki Nusseibeh needs no introduction to all of you here in the United Arab Emirates because of his support and his real faith in the power of culture and art in the United Arab Emirates, and his role in making this country and supporting this country as a global crossroads. And Final Marshal is going to talk about the European Youth Orchestra, which he has spent a lot of time focusing on. And he wears many hats, but I think he's here tonight in his role with the European Union hat on, and I'm very, very honored to have him on the panel. But we'll have a chance to talk a little bit more, but without further ado, Mrs. Paloma will talk about her video, and we'll have a presentation of a video. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Corbin. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, many thanks to the Abu Dhabi Festival and to Mrs. Odakano, who has all my admiration, for giving me the opportunity to participate in this privileged forum. This extraordinary festival is a true cultural crosspath that gathers the best music from the United States and other places, such as the Arabian, Latin American, and European countries in other many facets. Being here these days allows us to witness a fascinating dialogue between nations and cultures, as well as a practical demonstration of how culture has the ability of overcoming distances to get people together, or in other words, facilitating diplomacy. The Reina Sofía School of Music has also become a crossroads hallmark. We have the best of the legendary Russian school and also outstanding maestros from Germany, Italy, Great Britain, Holland, France, Croatia, Finland, and of course Spain. We have also welcomed the great Spanish singing school. Last year, you were able to enjoy the visit of Placido Domingo. We had Alfredo Kraus at the school, who inaugurated our voice chair, as well as Teresa Berganza. But our greatest satisfactions have probably been in chamber music. Our professors have been the leaders of the world's greatest string quartets, Quartetto Italiano from Italy, La Salle Quartet from the United States, and both Hagen and Alban Berg quartets from Austria. Having these glorious cultural realities intermingled and giving their seat in Madrid had resulted in the birth in Spain, for the first time in our history, of young quartets of true excellence. In her recent visit to Spain, Mrs. Cano had occasion of listening to one of them, our Quiroga Quartet, that has been named resident of the Royal Stradivarius collection and played therefore in the Royal Palace with those instruments that are unique in the world. It would be wonderful if the Quiroga Quartet would play soon in the Abu Dhabi Festival, as at the time indicated Madame Bonaparte. The Reina Sofía School of Music soon became a meeting place. Our professors come from 14 countries and our students from 53 countries, from all continents. But I must confess that gathering together cultures and nations was never our main purpose. This has been an added benefit. My only early aim was to create a school in Madrid where young, talented students could get the best possible education. To achieve this, I followed word by word Slava Rostropovich's advice. Paloma, you must bring the best, he said, no matter where we come from, and that I did. With the support of Her Majesty the Queen, and with the help of my musician friends, I searched worldwide for the best professors, regardless of their nationality or any other circumstance. And upon their arrival in Madrid, I gave them full freedom to attain the only objective I was looking for, to train good musicians. We used the same criterion to accept students. Auditions where talent is the only consideration. No recommendations are accepted, totally regardless of nationalities, age, degrees, or the student's financial status. Should they have no means, a scholarship is awarded. Only talent counts. As a result, practically 100% of our ex-students are developing outstanding professional careers. Let me give you a close example. Germán Díaz has started as principal oboe at the Qatar Philharmonic. The formula was simple but radical and resulted in a small revolution. It is a fascinating story that I would like to tell you with a short video presentation rather than with words.
Dreaming wasn't easy in Spain in the 80s, where the music scene had been depressed for centuries, but a dream gradually began to take shape at the Santander International Piano Competition. The notion of a vibrant music scene in Spain, with teachers who would enable Spain's highly talented musicians to shine. Masterminded, which would boast an outstanding teaching strategy with a four-pronged approach. Only take on the very best teachers. Let these teachers have complete academic freedom, personalised teaching, and always transfer what has been taught to the stage, which is the natural extension of the classroom. These principles were derived from an up-to-date version of the aspirations of the Institución Libre de Enseñanza, literally the free institution of education, and even the classic roles of master and pupil. This dream attracted an extraordinary group of dreamers: Alicia de la Rocha, Slava Rostropovich, Zubin Mehta, Yehudi Menuhin, and Paloma O'Shea. Her Majesty the Queen embraced the project from the outset when it was little more than just a good idea. Her presence reflected her endorsement of the project and enhanced our commitment to it. In October 1991, the school was set up in garages in a row of small houses in Pozuelo de Alarcón, near Madrid. This school would soon change the face of Spain and would become well known in Europe. The best teachers in the world went to work there: Dmitry Bashkirov, who taught piano, Zakharov Ron, who taught violin, Daniel Benjamin, who taught viola, and Ivan Moniget, who taught violoncello. The first teachers were immediately joined by José Luis García Asensio, violin, Ludwig Streicher, bass, and Piero Farulli, chamber music. Then it was the turn of Gerard José, who taught viola, tenor Alfredo Kraus, and cellist Natalia Shakovskaya. The wind section started to be deployed as soon as possible, with Hans-Jörg Schellenberger teaching oboe and Radovan Vlatkovic teaching French horn. Before too long, soloists with spectacular international profiles were graduating from the school: Asier Polo, Eldar Nebolsin, Claudio and Vera Martínez Mena, Arkady Volodros, Sol Gaveta, Aquiles Machado, and Leticia Moreno. And what was even more important was the fact that Spanish orchestras started to take on batch after batch of highly talented musicians, to the extent that a large percent of orchestral members actually hailed from the school and laid the foundations of a new sound. Music critics with an acutely refined ear were aware of a sudden change in the sound which was being produced by these young musicians. One of them headlined his article, "The Strings to Come," when referring to the speciality which we Spaniards always seemed to struggle with. The change turned into a revolution when, for the first time in Spanish history, two professional string quartets with international profiles were created by the school: the Casals and the Quiroga. It was a quick rise to the top. The school was just 10 years old when the English magazine The Sprad described it as one of the best schools in the world, if not the best. Once the school had achieved worldwide prestige, it built a new home for itself. A unique building in the Plaza de Oriente in Madrid, which reflects the great aesthetic aspirations of the project, as well as the ethical aspirations. The Sony Auditorium at the school is already one of Spain's leading art centres. The new building enabled the woodwind section to be completed, with Jacques Zoun teaching flute, Michel Arignon clarinet, and Klaus Tunemann bassoon. The violin section was also reinforced with Marco Rizzi violin and Anna Chumachenko. Previously, two great singers, Vanessa Bergantha and Tom Krause, had also joined the ranks. The school was now practically complete. One of the hallmarks of the project was a focus on chamber music from the outset. This led to the creation of the Madrid International Institute for Chamber Music by the Fundación Albeniz and Caja Madrid, Ministry of Culture, Madrid Regional Government and Madrid City Council. The school manages and administers the institute, which now boasts an international profile. Both the chamber repertoire and the orchestral repertoire also provide the foundations for the Encuentro de Música y Academia in Santander, which is managed by the school. This is attended by students from all the European flagship schools. The very fact that we play a leading role in the most demanding and most respected musical genre from which we have been alienated for so long demonstrates the huge historical leap our country has taken in recent decades. It was precisely an outstanding chamber musician, Menahem Bressler, who received the latest Yehudi Menuhin Prize for the integration of arts and education from Her Majesty the Queen. This prize is awarded by the school and has already been bestowed on key contemporary musicians and teachers. In the new building, the school and the Albeniz Foundation have developed their technological vocation, an area which had been of interest to the school for a long time. 3 RDI projects are noteworthy for their value creation. Iphigenia, a knowledge management platform, the sale of which enabled the new building to be constructed and also build up reserves which the school is using to wade through the present crisis. Magister Musicae, the virtual music school, which has proved successful in socializing excellence. And ClassicalPlanet.com, the website dedicated to quality music made by young people. They have been 2 thrilling decades during which the Reina Sofía School has more than achieved its original goals. It has developed a top-class international school in Spain. It has provided highly talented young Spanish musicians with a place to train and live alongside colleagues from all over the world as equals. It has enabled hundreds of students to have successful careers in music. It has enabled students to join important foreign orchestras and the main orchestras in Spain, which now boast 13% of musicians who trained at the school. It has produced over 5,000 concerts all over the world. It has led to the emergence of similar projects such as ESMO in Barcelona or Musiquene in San Sebastián. And in short, the school has made Spain lose its historical inferiority complex by demonstrating that we are capable of achieving excellence in music also. But aside from these particular objectives, the Reina Sofía School project has instigated a new model of patronage, the Albeniz Foundation model, which makes it profitable for businesses to contribute to music education and where the government plays a stabilising role. The fact that the school has weathered 2 major economic crises is solid proof of the validity of the formula. The first crisis was in 1992 to 1993, which threatened the school just when it had emerged, and the second one still hangs over our heads. Neither then nor now were the students aware of any significant cuts. The dream has come true, and everyone's contributed. Spanish society has taken a huge leap. Parents who try to take their children to the conservatory, and fans from many cities who have season tickets for the orchestra and the opera house. The authorities which have promoted infrastructure and supported orchestras in schools, and civil society. During this period, the Reina Sofía School of Music is proud to have been able to contribute its grain of sand.
This is the Reina Sofía School of Music, the project I have dedicated half of my life. I want to thank the sponsors who are the ones that make it all possible by offering the school financial independence, which allows me to give the professors complete teaching freedom, our main asset and the reason of our success. By being with us, our sponsors not only benefit culture and education, but also benefit their own enterprises, because the investment in our school produces significant returns in the form of concerts of their own use, as well as communication and marketing opportunities. I would like to mention as an example one of our main sponsors, Leopoldo Rodés, a key personality in the Catalonian financial and cultural fields, who opened the corporate doors in Barcelona to me. He's a member of our board and also founder president of the MACBA, the Museum of Contemporary Art in Barcelona. The foundation of the MACBA is directed by Ainhoa Grandes, who has become an expert in the Arabic artistic reality. The MACBA is another example of a very important cultural institution with a significant impact on the relations between nations. And I do not want to tell you more. Allow me to finish these words quoting Maestro Zuppi-Meta's speech at the closing ceremony of the school's academic year. Upon receiving from Her Majesty the Queen the Yehudi Menuhin Prize that is awarded by the school, he said to our students, "You will play hundreds of concerts and operas, but please, do not just play. Take the money and go home. That's not important. You cannot imagine the power our music has. You must experience that power and use it to promote goodwill in this world. This school has brought up ambassadors who will go into the whole world bringing that message. What a great musician and person. I could not agree more with him. Music and culture are powerful, especially in creating and stirring emotions. Our duty as cultural promoters is to ensure that this power is used to spread understanding and friendship among individuals and nations. This is the meaning of cultural diplomacy has for me. Many thanks for your attention.
Graphic demonstration of cultural diplomacy in action, and that brings us to our panel, which the topic is cultural diplomacy. And I think we'll start off with a little bit of discussion of the definitions of cultural diplomacy to shape the discussion. And what better way to do it than with Ambassador Rugh, who not only is a practitioner, but is at Tufts, as our introducer mentioned at the beginning. He's the Edward R. Murrow Visiting Professor of Public Diplomacy. And public diplomacy and cultural diplomacy obviously go together. And so without further ado, Ambassador Rugh, would you please maybe set the stage in terms of the definitions of cultural diplomacy?
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. I want to start by thanking Mrs. Hullakanu and the ADMAF for inviting us. This is a wonderful opportunity for Andrea and me to come back to the UAE, a place that we were so happy and hated to leave, but now we're back here with friends. We knew Hoda and Mohammed as friends when we lived here, and I always knew that she was a very talented person, but I'm now overly impressed with everything that she has done to create ADMAF with her friends here and her friends internationally. I can't say enough about her achievement in creating this institution with a lot of other people. But thank you so much for doing that, and for Americans and for the world at home. The panel is a diverse group, but I have to say that I feel privileged to sit here. I'm not a cultural person. I'm a former diplomat, now a teacher. And I have to start my remarks talking about the definition, because that's what I do with my class on public diplomacy at Tufts University. And I have to tell the students that they can have their own definition if they want, but I want them to know mine so that they can argue with me and disagree with me and prove me wrong, and often they do. But I have to say I'm privileged to sit here with Ambassador Corbin, who is one of our stars in the American Foreign Service, well known in Washington and throughout the region. And also I particularly respect his concern for culture. Not every American diplomat takes as much time and interest as Ambassador Corbin does. And sitting next to Zaki Nusseibeh is a privilege. When I first came and presented credentials to Sheikh Zayed as ambassador, he was my interpreter, and ever since that experience and having other chances to watch him in action, any American who asks me about interpreting between Arabic and English, I always talk about Dr. Zaki Nusseibeh because he's the best. But he's not only that, he's a cultured man. We would call him in America a Renaissance man who is deeply into culture. And Marquise, Mr. Marquise, has done a wonderful thing to bring to Abu Dhabi that amazing orchestra that we heard last night. So thank you for that. It's a privilege to be here. So let me quickly get to my definition of cultural diplomacy. Whether you agree with it or not, maybe we can have a discussion, but Zaki may have a different view. I distinguish between cultural diplomacy and cultural exchange, which is a much broader topic. Cultural diplomacy is a specific aspect and specific niche within cultural exchange, which happens all over the world without the involvement of diplomacy. Culture, in talking about cultural diplomacy, by culture, and there are different definitions of culture. By culture, I'm talking about manifestations of culture. That is to say, music, art, literature, language, and other, and theater and plastic arts that express the culture from which it arises, from the country and nation it arises. And so that's the culture we're talking about in cultural diplomacy. What about diplomacy? How is diplomacy related to culture? Well, in my lexicon, cultural diplomacy is part of public diplomacy that the ambassador mentioned. Public diplomacy, well, you know what diplomacy is. It's a form of communication between, traditional diplomacy, communication between two governments. And it's done in secret. It's not public at all. Public diplomacy is a government communicating with a foreign public. Now, they may communicate by explaining their policies, or they may communicate by supporting the dissemination abroad of the manifestations of culture. That's cultural diplomacy in my lexicon. Now, if I could give an example of Ambassador Corbin, you can correct me if I make a mistake here, but Ambassador Corbin meets with senior officials in the UAE and has a traditional diplomacy activity in private. The next day he may go and give a lecture at the Emirates Palace on American policy to a public audience. That's public diplomacy. The third day he may agree at the embassy to bring foreign students, American students, to the UAE to study, or he may agree to spend US government money to send Emirati students to the United States. That's public diplomacy and cultural diplomacy. So he does all three of those things. Now, it gets more complicated than that, because cultural diplomacy sometimes gets confused with political advocacy. And so the information part of public diplomacy, which he does when he explains American policy, is really not the same as his activity in supporting cultural diplomacy. In cultural diplomacy, the essential difference is, which makes it unique, is that he works in partnership with the creators of culture. The American government doesn't create culture. We don't have it employed by the US government, artists and musicians and members of orchestras and painters and actors, stage actors, but we work in partnership with them. And the US government's cultural diplomacy program identifies those American manifestations of culture that we want to send abroad with US government money in order to help enhance the American image abroad and help ultimately with mutual understanding. So there's a conflict here, or some kind of a tension here, but I can live with it because I think it makes sense. If you're doing cultural diplomacy, you're supporting American national interests because you're in some way enhancing the reputation of the United States. But you're also supporting mutual understanding. And in the law, the American law that is the basis of cultural diplomacy, the Smith-Bond Act of 1948, says the purpose of cultural diplomacy is to help foreigners understand America, but it's also to provide mutual understanding, and that's to help Americans understand foreign culture and foreign ways of thinking and foreign attitudes and foreign views. So it's really an altruistic effort paid for by the US government. So my definition of cultural diplomacy is that it's an activity that's supported and paid for by the US government, but it has a selfish and at the same time an altruistic purpose. Now, in the partnership side of this, and I'll finish with this, the partnership is extremely important. The word partnership is extremely important for all cultural diplomacy that the US government does. We work in partnership with ADMAF. We work in partnership with Emirates, which I worked with as soon as I left the US government. And Emirates is a wonderful private organization in America that does work in educational exchange, and here Mrs. Mary Corrado is the director of our program in the UAE. The Amity program is carried out partly with the support of the US government money, taxpayer money, but also partly with private funding. And they teach English here, they do educational counseling here, they help Emirati students get to the United States. And educational exchange is, in my opinion, maybe one of the most important aspects of cultural diplomacy. But I don't want to go on in that vein. Maybe we'll talk about educational exchange a little later. But there are many aspects to cultural diplomacy. And as I say, my definition includes partnership. And that's crucial because we don't create culture in America. We work with American artists, and over the years we have sent American artists that we believe represent the best in America to the Middle East. There have been some recent examples of American artists. Renee Fleming was, of course, here. She wasn't brought by the American Embassy because the American Embassy probably couldn't afford the price, but we are, and that, in my definition, would be Abu Dhabi cultural diplomacy to the benefit of the United States. Mutual benefit. We benefit because she's a great American singer, and it may have enhanced your impression of American music, but it also benefits the people here because she performed so well. So it's a mutual objective with partners.
Thank you very, very much. And Dr. Zaki Nusseibeh, in addition to being a Renaissance man, you're also on the boards of many, many Abu Dhabi's cultural institutions, including Paris Sorbonne, the Abu Dhabi Music, Culture and Heritage Organization. And I think that the first thing that Ambassador Rugh talked about was cultural exchange. And I think Abu Dhabi is a global crossroads and is a place where nationalities and artists are coming together, offers a unique opportunity to discuss both cultural exchange, but more importantly, and because of your previous role and your current role as an advisor and interpreter to Sheikh Zayed and his successors, I think it would be very instructive to get your views on how Sheikh Zayed viewed cultural diplomacy and how the UAE was established as a global crossroads.
Thank you very much. Let me first of all say that I do not disagree at all with Ambassador Ruh's definitions. I've learned a long time ago never to disagree about learned definitions of what terms mean. And I agree also with the explanation that you gave for them. And let me say that if we are to look at the United Arab Emirates today, living here today, we will see around us a modern Arab state that has been able over the last 4 or 5 decades to impose itself on the regional and international stage as an advanced country with cutting-edge infrastructure, social, economic, raw communications, financial services, and to accept this as taken for granted, that we live in this community that contains 200 nationalities, being harmoniously together, contributing to the prosperity not only of the United Arab Emirates, but also to all the communities that send people to work and live in the Emirates. I know parts of India, in Kerala, for instance, that have prospered as a result of what was happening here, as well as Rahim Khan and elsewhere. But if we were to look back 5 decades ago, to look at the situation as it existed then, and some people lived through that experience and saw what others believed about this region, including American diplomats and European diplomats, as well as journalists and visitors to this region. The prevailing judgment in the 60s was that the Emirates would not be able to survive the 70s because of the unstable conditions surrounding the creation of the state here, because of the general regional and international circumstances. Now, the very fact that we are where we are, I would say, more than any other country in the world, owes a great deal to diplomacy in the whole. And there is a thesis to be done about this, how the Emirates was able, over the last 5 decades, suddenly from being looked at by journalists and observers, and I keep a lot of records about what people said and wrote about the Emirates, suddenly is looked at today as a leading Middle East and country that has moderate policies that contribute to regional security and stability. And I would say that for the founder of this miracle modern state, for Sheikh Zayed, the vision was very clear from the very outset in the 60s, that building a modern state that can survive in the very turbulent environment of the 60s, we can go into details later if we want, but building a modern state requires 2 fundamental pillars. The first is to educate and train his own people so that they will become capable to face the challenges that he knew they are going to be faced with. And the second pillar was to open bridges to the rest of the world and to create relationships and partnerships and exchanges that will put an end to centuries of isolation and relative economic and political decline. Now that required a very active diplomacy from the very outset, and a central part of that diplomacy was a cultural diplomacy in the different ways that you have explained it, and I agree with your definition. And therefore culture was from the very outset a strategic part of the UAE's vision for its future and the future of its people. And to give you an example about this dynamic that we live in today, 40, 50 years later, let me just give you a glimpse about a week, an average week in everybody's life, but let me tell you what I have been through, for instance. Yesterday we were all together here and we enjoyed this amazing concert by the young people from the different countries of the European communities, UK, in order to present a wonderful concert. and they were introduced by young children of the UAE, both national and expatriate, with the drumming introduction that impressed the Harbiya that we call, that impressed you. And yesterday, the day before, we had, as you said, an American star opera, Renee Fleming, who came to sing with a German orchestra from Dresden, and we saw her also establish this amazing dialogue with an Emirati opera star, Sarah Painal, which was really one of the most amazing experiences I have had. Before these two concerts, I was in Dubai to attend a very vibrant art fair that brought together 80 different countries, galleries from these different countries, representing both art from this region and from outside, but also all the curators and museum directors and art critics and writers internationally attracted to see what is happening in the area. And that was linked to an earlier week of, again, cultural activity that was taking place in Sharjah, where a German Egyptian artist, Susanna Hafuna, was exhibiting in a house of the 19th century in the heart of Sharjah that used to belong to a family that had a long history of also being part of government relationships between the Gulf and the British government of East India. So all of this was happening in a few days. Next week, I will be taking a delegation, as Ambassador knows, Michael, from the Kennedy Center to look at Manarat Sabiya and see the amazing museums and cultural institutions that are developing on that island. And right after that, I will be talking to a group of scholars, the Mohammed bin Zayed scholars, who are United Arab Emirates students from different universities, taken by the New York University in Abu Dhabi in order to train them for leadership career. And this very morning, I was with Sheikh Nahia, who was with us last night, to open a careers conference at the Paris Sorbonne University in Abu Dhabi. So all of what was happening in 1 week, and this is just 1 week to give you the dynamics of what happens here, is part of that vision that started by saying that in order to create this modern state, we need to use diplomacy, and within it, cultural diplomacy, not only to understand and open bridges to the West, and you are quite right in saying it's mutual, because a central part of this cultural policy is to say that in the same way we want to open up to the rest of the world and bring the culture and art to us, we want them to understand about our culture and art and our poetry and our books, and so that the relationships of partnerships we create with them are not only based on economic, financial, petroleum interests only, but also share values and interests. And this continues in what we are creating around us today, because we believe that in the leadership belief that in this 21st century in which we are living today, it's no longer sufficient to have economic and political power in order to ensure the stability and security of a region or international, that we need this cultural exchange, this understanding of each other in order to create the elements that are necessary for peace. And we believe that we here in the United Arab Emirates can play, occupying this strategic position geographically between regions and cultures and countries, looking both east and west, can play a central part in this, not only to bring prosperity and stability for our own land, but also in this region. And this is why the Harbiya yesterday was an important part of the UAE vision of reinforcing the roots, our national identity and roots, and explaining to the outside world. And we can speak a lot about this because I've had a lot of exchanges with the UAE, with the Western and American teachers and professors and artists who come here discussing what their conceptions of the UAE were before they came and what they became after they came. Now let me end this very brief exposition by one very important remark, I believe. And you did mention it. You said that the government is not the creator of culture. Of course not. There is a time when governments are needed to create culture. This is when they need to put in the infrastructures, or the great museums of the Western world, or the great art collections, or the great cultural institutions were initially supported by governments and states and ruling families, and this is important for us. But I believe what is far more important, and here I would like to recognize what Rugh is doing in this respect. What is very important in the end is to make sure that whatever government does in terms of bringing the infrastructure, the cultural infrastructure into the community, that the private community itself can take up the responsibility of outreach to within its own community and can become the active participant and mover of our cultural dynamism. This is what I wanted to say now, and I'm happy to discuss or answer questions later, so thank you.
Thank you. We're really honored to have Marshall Marquise here, the CEO of the European Youth Orchestra. He's a practitioner, and after more than 25 years as a violinist in more than 60 countries, I discussed with him whether he was more, or he mentioned to me whether he was more on the creative side or more on the implementing side. And I think he's on both sides. And he had an experience in Venezuela with El Sistema, and I mentioned that hat. But he also represents the European Union's efforts to work overseas and has had experience there. And perhaps, Marshall, and again, it's a great honor to have you here, perhaps you could comment on both the definitions and how the European Union is looking at cultural diplomacy.
Certainly. Well, first of all, to me, I think it should be an honor of being on this particular panel. It's been really interesting to hear the remarks so far. And to take what Nusseibeh's idea, one of the things that struck me, it's my first visit to Abu Dhabi. And one of the things that's really come through very powerfully in the last few days is an open cultural border, which reflects, in a way, some of the things you've been talking about. Not only are there a number of events, but there's not a kind of, it's not a vanity program to show how great what Abu Dhabi is doing. You really sense a crossroad, and that brings up, first of all, then the nature of the reciprocal idea here. I defer completely to your definitions, so we could get into some of that later. But there are three things I really thought it might be worth briefly talking about. The first is identity. The second is the European project, as I'll call it for a moment. And the third is, if you like, the culture of what an orchestra is. I guess the thing I've done most of my life is to be involved in orchestras from, I think I had my 50th anniversary playing in orchestras, and being involved with them a while ago, identity. You'll see on the left-hand side of this panel 4 flags: Spanish, the US, the European, and the Emirates. And that's very interesting because we have with the Spanish exposition, you have 2 Americans, United Emirates, and I looked at the EU flag, there's somebody from Great Britain, and of course I could consider myself in a number of different ways. I can see myself as British, although actually that only goes back about 1.5 generations. I can see myself as a member of the European Union. And one of the things that struck me, Ambassador, about your definitions was a complete privacy that was given to the notion of the nation-state. All of us have got multiple identities. We can see ourselves in all sorts of different ways. And when we talk of cultural diplomacy, I guess that's the diplomacy end, cultural diplomacy. It's the notion that's to do with what happens between states. Now that's particularly of interest to me because as CEO of a European Union project, I'm involved with, my project involves to begin with people from 28 different countries. So how people from those number of countries come together sheds a fascinating light of tension between the national and the supranational, if I call it that for a moment. I guess since my wife is Italian, we met in South America. You know, my parents, my grandparents are from Latvia and from Poland. I guess it puts me naturally in the, I won't say the anti-national camp, but in the naturally non-national. And I would really encourage us to think in a more complex way about our identities, and therefore to see how our cultural diplomacy works, than simply to look at it in terms of how member states do business. So that's my beginning. I suppose in a way, you know, you talked about your qualification on the diplomatic front. I wouldn't begin to do that. I'm much more from the cultural side of the fence. So I'll talk about culture. But just very briefly, in terms of identity, the European project, which is a phrase that's often used, and how does that vary on culture, let's say. One of the things that I think is so powerful and that has led me really quite naturally within a European project is how the European Union began. And I always think it's worth us being reminded of that narrative, because these days, I'm sure the PR department of the European Union has quite a job. There are a number of challenges. And so let's remember that these states, which beginning with 6 and then 9 and multiplied to now 28, came together after the Second World War with a really quite powerful idea. And the idea is, we probably do better when we work together as nations than when we work against each other. After the terrifying experience of 39 to 45, instead of making war, let's make culture and peace together. I'm a child in the 60s, so I took to this very naturally. But that's what began the European project, and I never forget that. So in terms of identity, it doesn't matter whether you're from a country, or a tribe, or a family, or a group of friends, or a gang. Wherever you are, I would encourage us to see ourselves, if you like, with cultural relativism. We represent many different facets of that, and that coming together. That's why, as I say, I've been so impressed in Abu Dhabi, because there seems to be a kind of open door to that idea, which I found, I must say, very attractive. Now, orchestras take their place in that in a very, again, natural manner. I often think of the orchestra as a city, but you think of a state. There are different sections which behave in very, very different ways. There are kind of stereotypes. But essentially, one of the most extraordinary things, I guess the first orchestras arose, you might say, the 16th, 17th centuries. They've been around, the orchestra's been around for not quite half a millennium, getting on that way. And in the last quarter century, it's come under quite a lot of, I think, justified attack as a protected entity which feels it deserves funding and lives in a separate place. And yet, in the last 10 to 15 years, we've witnessed something quite extraordinary with orchestras, which is we're beginning to see their absolutely extraordinary power as transformational agents. And I certainly witnessed that with the European Union Orchestra. I worked with when I worked. It's watching, somebody talked the other day about the story of somebody who came to play in the orchestra from Latvia, a small state, and coming to talk immediately and sit next to, play next to somebody, so right on the other end of Europe. And you see very clearly, I can give you numerous stories if we have time from that orchestra you heard last night, of people whose lives have been changed by culture. And so that's, obviously, that's the great attraction, I think, for us of cultural diplomacy, is the ability to transform lives for the better. And I think there's almost, I think we live in a, I don't want to say much more actually, I just want to say one thing really, which is that I think we live in an area where the zeitgeist of this current era resides with the power of culture to transform in a practical and positive manner. So that the possibilities are really endless, and the stories are extraordinary. And in terms of cultural diplomacy, therefore, I think what we ought to be looking at is how we breed more of these amazing projects which improve lives and enrich lives. And again, Kanu, you've obviously devoted your life to this, and one sees that and one feels that. So if I look at Creative Europe, for example, as a programme, we've been very fortunate with the EU. We've had 2 bites at the apple this particular time, because Commissioner Vasily said all that was needed to say in that opening statement about Creative Europe. And it is an interesting and striking fact here that as many budgets are shrinking within Europe for things such as culture, a 9% increase has been given to the cultural budget from 2014 to 2020, which means almost 1.5 billion euros on culture in those 7 years. That's a wonderful contrast to the way that the Americans do cultural diplomacy. It's no criticism. But you are at the other end of the spectrum. What you do is to encourage people to go out and raise money and do their projects. One thing that Europe has done and the EU has done is to say we're prepared to put our money as a government down, put this money down. And there are things attached to that. What is it about? It's about audience engagement. It's about spreading culture. Actually, it's about cultural diplomacy. So I think I should say that.
No, well, there's just a couple themes that I'd like to highlight before we get to questions. I definitely think there's certainly a discussion to be had about the public versus private role in public sector versus private sector in supporting cultural diplomacy, and how that can be positive and how it can, in some ways, Ambassador Rugh and I talked about American television overseas. Is that necessarily a positive or a negative aspect of cultural diplomacy? It's obviously not part of what the government encourages, but it's happening, it's there. The other point I think that Marshall made very well is how does cultural diplomacy help people? I mean, after all, a lot of what we're talking about is countries, and what Zaki was saying, the vision of the late Sheikh Zayed was how do you build a better world? And so I think it's important to it's not just spreading culture and having a partnership and dialogue, but actually reaching people. And I know the El Sistema experience of Venezuela is all about changing the lives of children. But at this point, rather than hear me talk, perhaps we could open it to the audience to have some questions or comments on the definition of cultural diplomacy, on what we're trying to do, a European Union version, what the UAE is doing here, what the United States is doing. I think there's an enormous opportunity for debate and discussion here, and we haven't disagreed on anything yet. So.
Few hints.
Do I need a microphone? Or? Yes. Thank you for the wonderful introductions. My name is Neil van der Linden. I work a lot in culture exchange in the Middle East and North Africa, all over the region, from Morocco to Afghanistan and everything in between. And there's, in my work as a freelancer, I often touch also on the fields of cultural diplomacy, also when it comes to the let's say the more dirty parts, or the less harmonious parts. Cultural diplomacy in countries with which the relations are not that harmonious. And where cultural diplomacy is rather not only a tool for better understanding where it's desperately needed, but even a tool for where you can start change. I believe that the fall of the Iron Curtain had for part to do with cultural diplomacy before. Sending Bernstein and others from Clyburn to the east, and inviting Rostropovich, Kondrashin, and opera director Kupfer to the west. Similar efforts are now undertaken in China. It does not always work. I know that in the beginning, this millennium in Syria, including the United States, were doing a lot of efforts in cultural diplomacy to try to promote some change. And we know what's going on now. Current Russia is another. Netherlands last year had an extensive exchange with Russia in the cultural field, and you can ask what it was used for. But in general, I think cultural diplomacy can also very much be used in situations where you're not talking about a relation between friends or catalyzing friendship as we are doing here now. So maybe I would like to have some remarks on this, especially from the American side, about what your views on this. Maybe one of you, to the diplomat or the ex-diplomat from the United States, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Your comments are very appropriate, and they resonate with me because in looking at cultural diplomacy, I'm old enough to remember the Cold War and dealing with the Soviet Union in ways that were impossible to deal with directly through politics and through information programs, but through our cultural programs, and particularly music and the arts. We believe that we accomplished something in penetrating the Iron Curtain. And in the literature about the Cold War and the literature about public diplomacy in those days, credit is always given to American cultural diplomacy behind the Iron Curtain. Now, that I agree with that. I think that's correct, and I think it's still valid that where we have American diplomats deal with conflict and with controversy and with complaints and arguments and disagreements. By the way, I was thinking last night, listening to your wonderful orchestra perform, that with all of those different performers, the essence was harmony, and you had perfect harmony as far as I could tell. An American diplomat doesn't deal with harmony. We never achieve harmony. In fact, we deal with disharmony, and we feel it's successful if we reduce the disharmony some way. So it's a totally different function, although you have a diplomatic function, getting them all to work together, and all of those countries to work together. That's a footnote to what I really want to say is that, unfortunately, the Cold War experience that the United States had in using cultural diplomacy to deal with the Soviet Union meant that behind that was a concept in the U.S. Congress and the American public and the American administration that once the Cold War was over, we don't have to do cultural diplomacy anymore. So the budgets dropped dramatically for cultural diplomacy, and as a diplomat, I think that's a shame. But I still see places where we have conflict, where the only activities you can do as a diplomat are cultural. I remember before the current difficulties in Syria, we had conflict between the U.S. government and the Syrian government that had gone on for a long time. And I talked to our diplomats at the American embassy there, and they said, we can't talk to government officials, we're banned from contact, we can't get anything in the newspapers, nobody will listen to our story about our policies, but we can put on concerts, we can do lectures, we can do cultural events, and we're doing more of that. We're doing educational exchanges more because that's all we can do, and it keeps open the contacts, it keeps open the channels of discussion. And so we put more money into culture where we had political difficulties. And so that's how money, as we talked about budgets, that's how money is involved behind all of this.
Mark, I just wanted to draw out one of the aspects of what you just said, which is to talk about cultural message of tunnels, which I think is a very powerful idea. And I think the point about that, to me, is that you've got to keep that cultural channel going permanently. It's no good trying to just bring it in when you suddenly have a political problem in one area. And I was thinking, of a couple as a real example of that. A few years ago, I was working with an orchestra that had both Azerbaijani and Armenian musicians in it. And it was at a time when those two countries were practically at war. There were skirmishes and deaths on the borders. And I went to speak to a couple of people who, in Armenia, I knew, said, well, is it possible for us to do this? They said, well, it's probably not possible to go with each group to each country, but the musicians working together, of course, this is a politician, he said, of course, you must do this. And the point here is that culture needs to be sort of as an ongoing. It was very interesting. We were given information to read in advance of this. We get kind of so we're genned up and know what we're talking about. And one of the things I found very interesting about the language of that was that it talked about culture in terms of being an interesting tool, an aid, a way of doing things. And I'm reminded of I think it's Roy Strong called Art and Power. It's always been like this. Power in political areas, likes to use art because it's a powerful art for certain purposes. And so people on my side of the border, the border I'm talking about now is between the diplomats and the culture people. We like to keep that primacy of culture, and I think the notion of doing it as a long-term activity, keeping the tunnel going long-term, is extraordinarily powerful. And in areas of conflict, that's what allows that thing. You do the work now, you play together now. Sure, in 5, 10, 15 years' time, when the diplomats and the politicians in the country's ready, you'll do a joint concert. But for now, just get people together using culture as that partner.
Perhaps I can add to this from our own experience in the UAE. We have had recently here the visit of Daniel Barenboim, for instance, with the East-West Divan. And this is an amazing idea where cultural diplomacy is being used in order to improve life, in order to make people understand each other better, and in order to use music as a way of bringing together a universal language that everybody understands. Now, I have seen them, of course, in London before, but seeing them in Abu Dhabi and sitting with them as well, and with Daniel. Daniel, for those, I'm sure all of you know, but he did this with Edward Said, an American Palestinian academic who believed greatly in the cause of peace and did everything he can in order to promote it. And with Daniel, created this wonderful orchestra. Now they're trying to establish for it also a center in Berlin, where they were given this opera house in order to create a college and a center. But to see these people sit together as members of the same orchestra and to talk to each other and to understand each other, because they are speaking one language, which is the language of music. That is the kind of experience that cultural diplomacy is capable of bringing us.
Zaki, I completely agree with that. And I'm reminded in 2009, when there was the last major Gaza conflict, and I remember Daniel was actually with the orchestra, and he told me that he sat down with the orchestra and he said to these people, Israelis, Palestinians, Arabs, Jews, he said to them, okay guys, we have a war going on around us. What do you want? Do you want to stay or not? That's about as deep into conflict as the questioner could have referred to. And most of them, I think almost without exception, they decided to stay. That doesn't happen when you put the orchestra together the day before. And that's that point about slow burn, long-term work with culture.
Fantastic. While we're getting the microphone, I just mentioned also, I think Ambassador Rugh said that educational exchanges may be the best part of cultural diplomacy, and I would just say that education is one of those long-term tunnels. And just on Syria, for example, at one point the largest number of foreign doctors after Indians were Syrians. And think about that for the future of Syria in terms of hope. Please.
Thank you. My name is Nasser Altai. I come as a representative of the Royal Opera House, Muscat. And I think we witness this kind of cultural diplomacy on a daily basis in our programming and in our initiatives to reach out to various communities and to build bridges of understanding there through the arts. And thank you, Your Excellency, for bringing the orchestra, because we have many models where music is really the bridge that connects with our inner essence of humanity. We had the Afghan Youth Orchestra last month, and it's also another example from a torn-up country by decades of war. Its members are not professional musicians, but they're homeless and they're orphans who are truly victims of war, and their message is about culture and cultural diplomacy. Now, obviously, we in the Gulf have been blessed because of the peace, and because I think, to what Your Excellency you've alluded to, successful cultural diplomacy. But right now in the Arab world, obviously, there are many problems. Countries that are torn by war and devastation. So what can we do right now through music, and what are specific initiatives you've talked about or know of that we can do in order to bring peace to this region? Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Well, I think this is a very difficult question, because I think what we are passing through in the Middle East now is an existential crisis that requires long-term and major efforts that will not be resolved in a concert or in a musical college. And I believe that what is needed there really is for all the governments to focus on education. I mean, one of the things that I find also exciting about what you are doing today is to say that we need not only to bring orchestras and concerts to a place like Oman or Abu Dhabi, but also to have music colleges and institutes that can teach children from very early stage. I think, and then take them through the years so that when they listen to the concert, the music, what you mentioned, it resonates with me, what you have just said about the essence of a human being is through the music that he listens to. What I believe we need in the Arab world, and this is something that Sheikh Zayed was deeply convinced of when he started his nation building in Abu Dhabi, is education. Now this is, unfortunately, the Arab world has passed through the last 60, 70 years, through a number of successive failed periods of public and private policies, and we are paying the price of all of this. I mean, Arab reformers in the 19th century, Hussein and others came and said what we need to do is to reform the education system and then bring up young generations that can rise above the sectarian differences, the ideological, straitjackets in which today's youth unfortunately live through. And this requires very long-term planning. Here in the Emirates, I know the government is putting a major focus on reforming the whole education system. So it's not just a question of bringing international universities, although that is an important part of the equation, to raise the standards of education, to make more competition, to create a knowledge society in which professors from New York University and from Paris and Beirut and America will come, Missouri will come here and sit with students and professors. But to reform the very foundation of education itself, because what the Middle East is going through today can only be eventually resolved through a major effort in education. We cannot, you cannot jump over the stages of development. We need to go back, unfortunately, to roots. We need to start with education, and with education, move forward into a better future.
Thank you. My name is Gaia and I'm from Turkey. Thanks for the eye-opening speeches. I see artists and artworks travel all around the world to support peace and stability and to support cultural exchange. But there are many wars all around the world between governments and between citizens of a nation. In Egypt, in Syria, in Ukraine, in Russia. So how come state-sponsored cultural diplomacy or cultural diplomacy practiced by NGOs and private institutions can be more powerful? Maybe Your Excellency Dr. Zaki will comment on this.
That's very unfair. But I agree with you. I mean, I believe that non-government institutions are the real tunnel, eventually, for creating cultural diplomacy that is durable. I mean, I once again say governments can only invest in infrastructure, and they are needed to invest in infrastructure because that requires huge funds. I mean, look at the Opera House in Oman. Without the support of His Majesty the Sultan, we would not have been able to have this Opera House. And incidentally, for your information, I was fascinated yesterday to learn that Mr. Attai's uncle was one of the founders of our own cultural policies in Abu Dhabi. I worked with him. He's passed away now, I'm sad. But I worked with him when he was the Vice Minister for Information and Culture in Abu Dhabi before the establishment of the Federation. But in the end, we need, courageous people like Rugh here. You go down, for instance, in Dubai, and you look at the large number of galleries that are open. If you look at Abraj that supports Art Dubai, if you look, Eventually, the community itself must rise, I agree with you, and must take on this charge. The government cannot do much in order to support, except support it perhaps, invest when it is necessary, as you are quite right. I mean, there is more investment in music because it is necessary and it is useful. But in the end, it's the private community, the private sector, companies, societies, they must be shamed into knowing that they must support culture, not because it's a luxury, but because it's important for their children, because for the future of their own children and for the future of their own country.
Yes, I wanted to try and I could synthesize a lot. I mean, the question about education, which is very interesting, and your last question, which is that it seems to me, yes, we can talk about the responsibilities of states to initiate education in various ways and things of that sort. But in the end, it seems to me that all of us, we have to take on our own individuality, individual possibilities in whatever area we're in, wherever we can go. For the European Union Youth Orchestra, it was wonderful to be here this week. Last week we were in Thessaloniki in Greece, and a week before we did the concert, on the Monday concert, we were playing to over 3,000 children, young people in Thessaloniki. And the reason, one of the big reasons we're there, is that Thessaloniki has one of the highest youth unemployment rates in Europe. It's actually around 60% unemployed. So when I look at our players in the orchestra, over 90% will become professional musicians. A wonderful luxury for them. To bring them together, we all have a responsibility with whatever it is we're doing, and I often feel that it's too easy for us in our incredibly complex societies to aggregate and to say, oh well, the government should be doing that. During the government fight, we should be doing it, but we all must fight that fight, and I think that's a really important thing to kind of keep on to, is individual responsibility. Yeah.
Just a brief comment. I agree with you that we all have responsibility, but I would emphasize that we shouldn't ignore the accomplishments that governments and states and leaders in governments have undertaken. And I say that because today we visited, Andrea and I visited NYU Abu Dhabi. That is an extraordinary undertaking that's extremely successful. I know Dr. Zaki has been involved in that. I know Mrs. Corrado has been involved in that. That has nothing to do really with the U.S. government, but it's public diplomacy, in my definition, by Abu Dhabi in bringing together students from 100 different countries, bringing together American educators, and paying for it with the state coffers in Abu Dhabi. I mean, it wouldn't have happened, and I'm proud that it's an American university. It wouldn't have happened without the work of Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed and other people who have created this wonderful institution here. That's not easy to do. I like the idea of Emiratis going to America. By the way, the UAE has done a lot in that respect. If you look at the list of all Arab countries and how many students they send to the United States, the UAE ranks number 4 in that list, as high as Egypt, with a small population. It's sending Emirati students to study in America and paying them generously, paying them, Mr. Ambassador, more than we pay them. So I believe in educational exchange. I believe that, I think more Emiratis ought to go to America. I think more Americans ought to come here, because Americans are terribly ignorant about the Middle East. But I'm proud to know that NYU has been a success here.
I think we wait one more question, and then we will wrap up.
Yeah, good evening. It's Bart Hesseling. I analyze relationships between Gulf and Europe. We all know the cultural openness of the UAE. But I wonder, and my question is mostly directed to Dr. Nusseibeh, is how could the UAE enact and deploy its own cultural diplomacy There's one really good example in Paris, which is the Arab World Institute, which UAE co-founded as part of the Arab League. And more recently, there has been a really great touring exhibition on the Hajj funded by the Saudis. Also on a private level, Prince Albeniz bin Talal, he donated a large sum of money to the new Islamic art wing of the Louvre in Paris. So my question is, how could the UAE enact such a policy? What would it look like? For instance, would it be through the use of promoting the Arabic language? Because as you know, for the French and the British, the Germans, the Spanish, the Chinese, language institutes are the backbone of their cultural diplomacy. So could this be something that the UAE could deploy in the future?
Absolutely. I think this is a very important point that you raised, which is that the United Arab Emirates should not only be involved in bringing institutions and cultures from the rest of the world to the UAE, it's for its own people, the inhabitants, the expatriates, and the students that it brings here, but should also go abroad. Now, the Institut Monde Arabe that you mentioned, let me tell you some more information on it. The whole idea gestated in a meeting that Sheikh Zayed had with President Giscard d'Estaing, and I was the interpreter during that meeting. And Abu Dhabi was more than just founder within the Arab League, but it was one of the original instigators of that project. So was, for instance, the project in Alexandria, the Alexandria Library, in which the French, again, that was a meeting with President Mitterrand that started, and with His Majesty the King of Spain, who came with Her Majesty the Queen to Alexandria to launch that project when it was first started. So the United Arab, the cultural policy, the cultural diplomacy of the UAE also goes in that direction. A number of catalyst projects have been adopted. I know, but let me tell you about Abu Dhabi Culture and Heritage, for instance, and Tourism Authority, the book projects that it produces, the translation of books into foreign languages, as well as the translation of foreign books into Arabic, the support of international literary prizes. We have the Sheikh Zayed Prize that has gone now across the world in order to give prizes and to show appreciation for international and Arab authors. The International Arab Literary Prize, what they're known as the Booker Prize, Arab Booker Prize, was instigated in Abu Dhabi. We supported it, we supported, and this prize has become now one of the most famous across the Arab world, and in its 7th year, and every book that is on a short list gets translated into several languages, including Spanish by some now South American publishers who will make it more available to a wider audience. So the idea of a cultural diplomacy is that it should work in both directions. And I take up your idea of that there is each individual, like each country, has multiple identities, but by talking about an identity, the roots of a nation are always what is the crucible in which its own culture can evolve. And we here have 200 nationalities. Culture becomes enriched and cross-fertilized by the different influences that you have from the Indian subcontinent, from Iran, from around us, from Europe. But in the end also, the roots are important so that your own culture can evolve within this. This, for me, it shows the richness of culture and the ability of this culture to evolve with the year. But anyway, thank you for your question, and I believe that, yes, we are aware of how important it is, and the government is aware, the cultural authorities are aware of how important it is to take our culture abroad. Next month, there's going to be in the Louvre in Paris, the Abu Dhabi acquisition. The Abu Dhabi Louvre acquisitions will be put on show for the first time so that the whole world will begin to look at what is going to be a future, the birth of a collection, but also a special pavilion will be named after Sheikh Zayed within the Louvre, as well as the restoration of a theater in Fontainebleau, in the old chateau in Fontainebleau, which will carry the name of Sheikh Khalifa. So there are many of these projects that have been done across the globe. The United States, I mean, the ambassador is aware of a number of things that were done with hospitals and universities and schools. So yes, I mean, this is a very important point you raised, and yes, the authorities here are very keen to work in both directions.
Well, unfortunately, I know there could be much more discussion on this topic. Just to summarize, and yes, we have the property, please.
I have a remark, really, and that so much of what we have talked about really hinges on one thing, and that is tolerance. Tolerance, first of all, that the governments, and there an example is, of course, the UAE government, in particular, all this would not be possible if there wasn't the basic attitude, and that is the attitude that does come from the leadership and from the very top, that one approaches all of this in a spirit of tolerance. And I think we have seen this right from the beginning, even from the time of Sheikh Zayed's brother, who also was ruler for 38 years. He gave 2 plots of land to 2 Christian churches to build, and that is a sign of tolerance, which at that time was probably had some of the neighbors, neighboring countries, quite astonished. And the word tolerance, I think, also hinges on what is ultimately achieved with diplomacy or cultural diplomacy. It is to make those individuals who do not, maybe they're instilled, much of their understanding of the world could be very adversarial, because that's what they learn in their environment. And when they have a chance, through music, through being in a group which does cultural things together, when they realize that the other is the same as myself, and one becomes tolerant. And that is also what I think in both those frameworks that the European governments have decided, each government, that one is being tolerant towards the other governments and towards the other nations, and no longer does one think of how to defeat them. And that then transports and transmits with the cultural exchanges into tolerance between people, and that's really what we need. So I think the word tolerance somehow has a lot to do with cultural diplomacy.
No, I think that's it. When governments become involved in promoting culture in the negative ways, it often is by not bringing that spirit of tolerance that is so important. So I think, to summarize, this has really been an honor for me to be on this panel. I think we have a definition of cultural diplomacy that involves the communication by governments, but that is a partnership between both public and private sectors, and between the giving country and the receiving country. It's a partnership that involves education, that involves many, many aspects of a form of diplomacy, which is the public kind. I think that we have the example of the United Arab Emirates, which is a country in a region that is under such turmoil, that is trying to, and is successfully reaching out, and has reached out thanks to the vision of the late Sheikh Zayed. And I think we have the issue of identity and the issue of helping people as individuals and as a government. I mean, in the United States, our identity is partly built on the fact that we are a melting pot. I think the example of Europe, bringing together all the different countries of Europe, which have very, very deep traditions, suggests again another point that gets to Frauke's point at the end on tolerance as being such an important element of cultural diplomacy. So thank you, and again, thank you to